Hi, my name is Claire Baker, and this is my visual research project on the Galle Fort in Sri Lanka. I chose this topic because I wanted to discover more about Sri Lanka, as it is not as much talked about in our class curriculum. I was very excited about the things I found while researching and hope to share my knowledge through this presentation. First, I would like to share about Sri Lanka in general, since it is a small country that can often get overlooked but has some amazing features. The Sri Lankan highlands are located in the south-central part of the island and are home to wilderness-protected areas, Horton Plains National Park, and Knuckles Conservation Forest. The unique part about this area is that it is classified as a montane forest, also known as a cloud forest, which means that this land is a rainforest above 1,000 meters elevation. Millions of years ago, these mountains were formed, and over time, they've become more and more special. There are so many rare species of animals here, including the leaf-nosed lizard and the Sri Lankan leopard, and some are still being discovered. Tourists from all over the world come to visit Sri Lanka for a variety of reasons, including their magnificent beaches that go on for miles. Although it is a small and beautiful island, they have far less tourists than other islands similar, which makes it perfect for a peaceful vacation. Other things that draw people in is the hospitality and the cuisine, since the people of Sri Lanka are known to be extremely nice and welcoming and serve delicious foods. Sri Lanka is home to many important crops, including tea, spices, especially cinnamon, and fruits and vegetables. There are many tea plantations on the island that have been there since the 1800s and have daily tours to show people around. Tea is also a vital part of Sri Lankan trade as well as spices. Culture is also a large part of Sri Lanka, and I will talk about that more later. There are many landmarks and famous architecture spots in Sri Lanka, including the Metagaragia Vantage, which is situated in the middle of a dry zone forest area, adding its mystic view and has a history going back to the pre-Christian times. The Brahmic characteristics found on the bricks and some of the stone carvings is an indication of the long history of the site. The first reference to the site in the chronicles is during the King Kanitha Tisa of the Anuradhapa era. Later, many kings have contributed to this complex, and finally after the invasion of Malacca, this site was too abandoned when the Sinhalese migrated to the southern parts, unable to withstand the torture. According to the Kulu Wasana, the Lesser Chronicle of Sri Lanka, the Vantage was built in the 7th century by King Agabubadi VI. The Nine Arches Bridge is located just out of Ella in a town named Dharamda, at a distance of 2.8 kilometers from Ella Station. Visitors can hire a tuk-tuk from the station at fare ranging between 200 and 300 Sri Lankan money. And another option is to walk from the station to the bridge, which is only a 20 to 30-minute walk. Singaria is a fortress palace that was built by a ferocious king in the 5th century. Perched on a massive rock cliffside overlooking forests in Sri Lanka is just as impressive today as it was then, and is known as Lion Rock. The Temple of the Tooth carries a lot of value to Buddhists all over the world and has immense cultural value. The architecture is of unique Kandyan architectural style, with a combination of unique style to build Dalada Midira, the shrines which housed the sacred tooth relic previously. The city of Galle is on the southwest coast of Sri Lanka, about 2 hours away from Colombo, Kaikar. It's famously known for its fort and the fortified old city founded by the Portuguese. The primary language is Sinhalese, but Tamil and English are also widely spoken. It is the 9th largest city in Sri Lanka. Galle also has a variety of art showcases, local antique stores, and crafts that go along with the city's laid-back demeanor. And finally, the Galle Fort. Galle Fort has a rich history, and that begins before the fort was even constructed. The Indian Ocean was controlled by Arab, Chinese, Malay, and Indian merchants during the late 1400s and early 1500s, who all shared control until the Portuguese joined in and took over due to their high-powered vessels. The Portuguese started their journey to control this part of the world in the Maldives, but were pushed to Sri Lanka, which sparked their realization that this might be the place to settle down. They first established a settlement in Colombo in 1518 in order to trade with others, but then Sri Lanka started having trouble. The king of Koto was killed by his 3 sons, who then took the land and split it amongst themselves. The Portuguese were helping the new king until he started forcing them out of his land, which is when the Portuguese took refuge in Galle. The Portuguese constructed the Santa Cruz de la Galle in 1588, which is the start of Galle Fort. The fort was much smaller than it is today, but consisted of a rampart and 3 bastions to defend the peninsula from the northern side. This was the beginning to the long history of Galle Fort. The history continues with the Portuguese, because although they were attempting to defend their fort from the northern side, they failed to defend it from the seaward side. The battle for Galle Fort was fought between the Portuguese and the Dutch, and it lasted around 5 days. In 1640, the two fought violently, and both suffered many losses, but on the 5th day of battle, the Dutch took control of the fort. In 1640, Galle Fort was now controlled by the Dutch, along with much of the rich natural resources from Sri Lanka. Galle would be the Dutch headquarters in Sri Lanka until they took control of Colombo in 1656. They also constructed a new fort in place of the Portuguese fort, which was made of stone and coral, and they named it Point de la Galle. The Dutch were much more strategic about their fort and created a much larger fort with defense strategies, but also a city grid that was inside of the fort, with buildings, trade establishments, warehouses, barracks, churches, carpentry, and a Dutch-style houses that housed hundreds of families. Great Britain was the next group to move into Sri Lanka. In 1796, Galle Fort fell into their hands. In 1802, the Treaty of Amiens was signed, which then, in turn, forced the Dutch out of British territories in Sri Lanka. Great Britain soon controlled the entire island in 1815, which made them the strongest competitors compared to the Portuguese and Dutch, since they were unable to complete this. Galle Fort still remained a very important part to the British, and they kept it as their administrative headquarters. The British kept the skeleton of the fort that was built by the Dutch, but added a new gate, a lighthouse, and blockhouses. They also built a tower to commemorate Queen Victoria in 1883. This is when the fort started being known as what we know it now as Galle Fort. The British made some more modifications after World War II, but it has stayed very similar since their initial construction. Although the fort remained for administrative purposes, the ships and trade traffic was being directed to the new harbor in Colombo during the late 1900s. This meant the decline of the fort, since it was no longer needed for its original purposes. By the mid-1990s, the fort was almost completely abandoned. Sri Lanka gained independence as the Dominion of Ceylon in 1948, but it was not until 1972 that the Constitution of the Republic of Sri Lanka was adopted and recognized. With that being said, this abandoned fort was now Sri Lanka's problem, but the nation didn't have the money to deal with it. Then, in 2004, there was a devastating tsunami that took out major parts of Sri Lanka and flooded the fort. The area has since been designated to have millions of dollars worth of remodeling that started in 2019 that's funded by the World Bank. The fort was also declared as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The fort is still open to visitors today and has much its original plan, which makes it one of the oldest existing forts in the world. It is also still one of the best still existing examples of a fortified city by Europeans in the South and Southeast Asia, and is indeed an important vestige of the country's troubled yet colorful colonial past. "14 bastions have been identified on the fort today. A bastion is a defense mechanism in a fort that is built at an angle to the line of a wall, so it allows defense fire in several directions. The Sun Bastion was built around 1620, and it was very strongly built by the Portuguese and named São Iago. Then, on August 4th, 1667, it was renamed by the Dutch as the Sun Bastion. By around 1760, there were about 15 cannons installed on the bastion. I'm going to talk about a few more of these that had major significance, including the Triton Bastion. It may have been seen as a minor bastion on the exploratory map of Galle Fort, which was drawn by the chief engineer, but it was recorded that there was a windmill erected here to draw water that filled the tanks of seawater to supply carts when they went through the roads of the fort, spraying seawater to keep down the dust free and cool. Point Utrecht Bastion has been named after the hometown of the first clergyman of the Dutch Reformed Church who arrived in Galle in 1641. By 1760, it had 6 cannons installed, and after the first lighthouse on the Flag Rock Bastion was destroyed by a fire, the new lighthouse, which was 92 feet high, was erected here in 1939. Bunkers had built around the lighthouse since the Second World War, and they had been removed some time ago. The Fishmark Bastion is also found in Remir's map of Galle Fort from 1790. It is believed it was named Fishmark because of fishing craft that could be well observed from here. Ancient monuments within this historical complex included the lighthouse, the clock tower, and the Dutch First Reformed Church. The military architecture of the fort is European in design, which is unique to the Galle Fort since it is still preserved fortified city in Southeast Asia. Next, I'm going to talk about a few of the main architecture points in the fort, including the clock tower, the library, and the Dutch Reformed Church that I have spoke on a little bit earlier. The clock tower can be found inside the fort immediately within its ramparts. The clock tower is built in the late 19th century in honor of Dr. Peter Daniel Athiones, a colonial surgeon born in Galle. The inscription on the plaque of the clock tower reads, "This tower erected by the public subscription to the perpetual memory of Peter Daniel Athiones, in testimonial of his skill and benevolence in relieving human suffering." It is 25 meters tall and on the side of what was once the guard room overlooks the central moon bastion and the Galle Cricket Stadium. The library and the church stand next to each other on Church Street, and the library was established in the year 1832 and is one of the oldest public libraries in Sri Lanka. The church was built in the year 1706 by the Dutch Empire. The Dutch Reformed Church is one of the oldest operating Protestant churches in the island, and is one of the most important places to worship in the island, as well as showcases the multiple cultural identity of the island. Here are my citations, and thank you for listening.